You know what I'd like to know, Carl?
Yeah.
I'd like to know what the odds are David Hogg actually used that
Well,
analogy.
he went to Harvard, so I was surprised he ever heard of General Halleck because
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Thursday, May 1st. I'm Andrew Walworth, and with all the breaking news out of the White House today, we're starting and we're ending today's program with RCP White House correspondent Phil Wegmann. So, Phil, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me, Andy.
We have our first major staff shakeup of Trump's second term. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz is leaving his job as National Security Advisor. And that looked sort of earlier today to be the first big ouster of the second Trump administration. But then later in the day, Donald Trump posted that Waltz would in fact just be changing jobs to become the new UN ambassador. So, Phil, what's going on at the White House?
Well, make no mistake, this is absolutely a demotion in the Trump administration because the president does not think very highly of the United Nations. That's no secret. But what's interesting is that he had been struggling to find a replacement for New York Representative Elise Stefanik, who was going to step into that role for some time, but then returned to the House. My sources tell me that Rick Grenell, who previously worked at the UN, was not interested. And I think that what we're learning here with the two-step where Waltz leaves the National Security Advisor role and then moves over to the United Nations, I think what we're seeing from that is Donald Trump doesn't like giving the media or Democrats a scalp. This is an opportunity for him to kill two birds with one stone. He's able to have Waltz step aside, post-Signal fiasco, and then also find someone to plug and play over at the United Nations.
And was this planned out? The question with Trump is always, how much of this is fourth dimensional chess where he's, he got all the reporters to talk about how, chaos at the White House. And now he can say, no, it was a deft political move. But is it planned out, or is it just, one thing after another at the Trump administration?
I think that after talking to a few folks, the sense that I get is that this is a happy accident. Certainly, Donald Trump was not happy with the way that Mike Flynn was treated during his first administration. He didn't want a replay here. Obviously, the fact pattern is very different. But in this situation, I think it was Trump again trying to find someone for the United Nations, trying to deal with the Waltz problem, if you will. And here, I think that is Trump sort of, going with his gut. But yeah, Waltz seemed to be surprised. He was doing Fox and Friends this morning. He was in that cabinet meeting just yesterday where photographers spotted him texting using Signal underneath the table.
Yeah. So speaking of surprise, and we should just say say this. Marco Rubio seems like he might have been a little surprised, or at least his press spokesperson was surprised today at the State Department briefing. He is going to serve as interim National Security Advisor, and he will hold both jobs, State Department and National Security Advisor, simultaneously. But now we have a job open of National Security Advisor or State Department, depending on what they do with Rubio. But I've heard that Witkoff might be in the bullpen. What are your sources telling you?
Yep, certainly Witkoff doesn't have the resume that a Marco Rubio or a Waltz does, but the guy has results. Think back to the hostage negotiations. I think the number of Americans freed under this administration is up to 47. I might be wrong on the count there, but he's well trusted within both, Trump world and the White House. What I would not be too surprised, though, to see is perhaps maybe Rubio doesn't hold both posts concurrently for a couple of years, but maybe he holds them for a good 6 months or so. Because if you look at Rubio and then you look at Waltz, what you see is that Waltz was kind of a reformed war hawk, whereas Marco Rubio, I mean, we've interviewed him numerous times and detailed his evolution, both on the foreign policy question and the question of global trade. He really does have the fervor of a MAGA convert. One of the things that was interesting about Rubio is after he loses in 2016, he doesn't just say, ho-hum, too bad. Instead, he goes on this nearly decade-long project trying to understand why it is that the traditional conservative Republican answers didn't appeal to the American electorate. And he's written, I think, a couple books at this point, sort of going through what he sees as a failed policy consensus on trade, on national security, and how that might have worked out really well for the coasts, but it disadvantaged the middle of the country, and in his estimation, it disadvantaged the country overall. His last book is Decades of Decadence, where he sort of follows the United States post the fall of the Berlin Wall, and his argument is, that we got it all wrong with globalism. That's an argument that's very cogent to Donald Trump.
Yeah, this job, National Security Advisor, it's interesting. And you mentioned Mike Flynn earlier. He lasted 22 days. People should remember it. And Trump, in his first term, he had 4 national security advisors. It's a job that doesn't require Senate confirmation. But the job that Waltz is going for now, the UN, does require that. That means he's got to sit in front of Senate Democrats up on the Hill and explain himself. And he will no doubt be asked about Signalgate.
He really will.
So that's something I guess people will be looking forward to hearing.
Yeah. So a couple things here. First, he's absolutely going to be grilled by Democrats on the question of his use of Signal, because the ambassador to the United Nations also has access to, sensitive information. So, we'll wait to see that gauntlet. I think Democrats are licking their chops right now. But what this episode also kind of points to is, what about Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth? Because he was sharing, they don't call them war plans, but certainly, orders of operations for our strikes against the Houthis in that group chat. And then also we learned later that he was sharing information, with his lawyer and his wife on a separate chat. So, what does Waltz exit mean for Hegseth? And then when it comes to the national security advisor role, generally, this is someone who's sort of, a traffic cop. They're there, policing the different opinions coming from the State Department, coming from the Pentagon. Now that Rubio's in that role, it's going to be interesting to see if he's able to, not just present his opinion at state, but also, give the Pentagon sort of a fair shot as well as these disagreements arise.
Yeah, so I want to talk about one other thing with you, and that's this Wednesday night signing of Scott Bessent and the Ukrainian economic advisor, or economic minister, rather. They signed an economic partnership agreement. It's giving Washington access to Kyiv's mineral resources. How does this help Ukraine in their war effort at this point? How is again, this is being perceived as sort of a good thing for Ukraine and a little bit of a brushback to Vladimir Putin.
The argument that the White House presented when Zelensky was in the Oval Office, when they expected this agreement to be signed back in February, was that closer economic ties necessarily meant that the Russians wouldn't want to mess with Ukraine if American business was there. And the expectation is that, that closeness would serve as a deterrent. Since Zelensky and Donald Trump aired their grievances in the Oval Office, since that blow up, there's been a question of when will the Ukrainians come to the table. My sources told me that all day yesterday, the White House was ready to sign, and they had been for some time, but that it was the Ukrainians who at the last minute sort of wanted to renegotiate some terms. I think that the Ukrainians may have learned that they were on a bit of thin ice, that patience was waning, and finally put pen to paper.
Yeah, it's pretty symbolic when you really sort of tear it apart a little bit. It carries the no security guarantees, but it does make two interesting points. It makes this reference to large-scale destruction caused by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So it puts the blame on Russia for the war, which is a nice thing for Ukraine, I think, at this point, given the way the president has talked about Putin. And it also talks about buying arms from the U.S., that somehow that will be financed through this mechanism. Whether America ever sees a dime from this deal, I think is a legitimate question to ask. But it certainly opens the door, leaves open the door that yeah, we're going to keep providing the Ukrainian army with arms that they need to prosecute the war. So
100%.
So in that regard, it's kind of a good thing for Ukraine. Maybe a bad thing for Russia. But I also feel, I'd like to know how you feel, you know, anyone who thinks that the U.S.'s economic interests would trump their strategic interests in a situation like this is kind of misreading history. Because if you look at Vietnam or you look at Afghanistan, you know, we're more than happy to cut and run after investing billions and billions and billions of dollars in these efforts, if the sort of global strategy dictates that.
Certainly, we're not also 100% on whether or not these rare earth minerals are there. There's some speculation that the surveys that the Ukrainians have been relying on are old Soviet surveys. Developing rare earth minerals, it's time consuming. So there's a lot of questions about how the United States would actually get repaid, which is the way that Stephen Miller and others are trying to present this deal to the American public. But, you know, those two things that you mentioned a second ago, putting the onus on Russia for starting the war and U.S. sale of weapons to Ukraine is massively significant. And that's why I think that you had both English Prime Minister Starmer and the French President Emmanuel Macron in the lead up to the initial day when this deal was supposed to be signed in February, really heralding this. They saw this as building momentum. I think there's two other things to keep in mind. The delay means that this deal is coming very close to Trump's 100 days, and the White House is going to want to herald this. They're going to want to herald this at a moment when Donald Trump has expressed his frustration with Vladimir Putin.
Right.
The momentum here seems to be turning in the Ukrainians' direction.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, Phil, thank you. Phil will be back later in the program. We're going to talk about a totally different story. So this is the Phil Wegmann Show today, but don't go away. When I come back, Carl and Tom will be here. We're going to talk about some other news involving the Democrats. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. Guys, we've got this little dust up among Democrats. I want to talk about it. It involves long-term Democratic political operative James Carville and David Hogg, who is vice chairman of the Democratic Party. So, Tom, this is what I understand. Hogg has said he was going to raise $20 million to challenge incumbent Democrats in safe blue districts. He was going to replace them with more progressive candidates. Carville disagreed, went so far as to call Hogg a, quote, contemptible little twerp. But apparently Carville has reconsidered. What's going on?
I don't know. I seriously don't know. So, yeah, I mean, that's basically it. Remember, Carville was the one who came out initially and said, listen, just Democrats, just lay low, you know, let Trump, he's going to screw everything up, give him the rope to hang himself, and don't do anything stupid. And he was criticized for that because Democrats want to fight, and they thought that was a terrible idea. And so David Hogg was in that camp, and of course he's now trying to fight Democrats. And Carville has always said, "Look, I want to beat Republicans. I don't want to beat Democrats. That seems crazy to me." So they were on. So he did. He called him this name. He's been given some interviews, and then they were on Tara Palmieri's podcast the other day, both of them at the same time, and they had this back and forth. And Carville basically said to his face, to David Hogg's face, you know, it's a terrible idea, and you know, I don't think you should be doing it. And I don't think he got personal and called him names, but that was just the other night. And then early this morning or late last night, he tweeted out. He said, "This is James Carville." He said, "Just called David Hogg. He reminded me of the story after the Battle of Shiloh. Henry Halleck urged President Lincoln to fire Ulysses Grant. Lincoln said, quote, 'I can't fire him. This man fights. David Hogg fights. The DNC needs him.'" So it was like a total 180. At first I was like, I think he's been hacked. I think James Carville's account has been commandeered by some, progressive. I don't know what's going on. They were now they're buddies, and now James Carville thinks it's a good idea to primary Democrat incumbents. I mean, that seems crazy to me. So I don't know exactly what's going on.
Carl, do you know what's going on?
No, but I would like to know who interceded. I would like to know who called James Carville and said, James, you're doing what you don't like. You're picking a fight with a Democrat. This isn't, we're working on David Hogg to try and moderate. We're working behind the scenes. You're not helping. So make this go away. I'd like to know who made that call.
You know what I'd like to know, Carl?
Yeah.
I'd like to know what the odds are that David Hogg actually used that analogy.
Well, he went to Harvard, so I was surprised he ever heard of General Halleck. Because
I was going to say, does that sound like something David Hogg would call James Carville? Let me remind you of the Battle of Shiloh. It's like, come on. That sounds like just total bullshit.
I was skeptical of that myself, Tom, but I didn't want to accuse James of making up the story. I didn't want to, but I wonder.
Well, just to be fair to these two gentlemen, the quote, and Tom, I think you had it right. He said, he reminded me of the story of. It didn't say that he told me the story of. He just made,
so I
said, you know what this reminds me of? But my conversation with David Hogg reminded me. So that's another way to interpret it. But I like your way better.
Actually, you might be right. Because the other way makes no sense to me. That David Hogg is going to tell James Carville, remember the Battle of Shiloh.
But, Karl Rove made an interesting point about this, which is he suggested, God forbid that this is just a publicity stunt, that, in the last cycle, the Leaders We Deserve PAC, that's David Hogg's PAC, they raised $11.9 million, which sounds like a pretty good amount of money. They only spent $266,000 on actual candidates. That's 2.2% of what they raised. Where did all that money go? Went to operating costs. David Hogg's
like a salary for David Hogg?
Yes, stuff like that. So the idea that they would be able to raise $20 million, and I think maybe Jonah Goldberg figured out what, with that ratio, how much money they had to raise. It's $1 squillion they'd have to raise. So it may never happen.
Carl, I didn't know you could major in grift at Harvard. Is that?
Well,
you get a master's degree in grift?
The fundraising costs, I guess, have gone up.
Right. Well, Carl, the other wrinkle on this story is this Native American Party activist.
Before we get to her, you mentioned Karl Rove.
Right.
I'd like to mention to our listeners, Karl Rove wrote a heartbreaking column that Wall Street Journal ran it. Tom put it on our front page today, and I just urge people to go read it. Even if you don't, you can get past the Wall Street Journal's paywall, I think, if you link to it through RealClearPolitics. And it's about a woman who worked for Karl. I met her when she worked in the White House. Just a lovely person, and fought a brave battle with cancer. And I just urge people to read it, because he does. Karl Rove wrestles,
beautifully written.
Yeah, and what wrestles with what we all do, and it's an ageless question. Why does God let terrible things happen to good people? So you mentioned Karl, but I thought I'd mention that call.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I read it as well, and it is a great piece of writing, and I commend it to people as well. But let me talk to you about Kaylin Free. She is a Native American Party activist. She's challenged the election of David Hogg on procedural grounds, saying the committee ran what she called a fatally flawed election that violated the DNC charter and discriminated against 3 women of color candidates. What do you make of the challenge? And could the DNC use that as an excuse to move on from David Hogg?
That's what it sounds like they may want to do. I don't think the Democrat National Committee needs any more identity politics, fights. I don't really think that's been helpful. I think they've gone pretty far with that. But Kaylin Free is a serious person and a kind of a fresh voice. Dane Strother, who we've had on this program, worked for her, managed one of her campaigns. And, you know, I think she might have been a better choice to begin with. I don't know, using this technicality to remove Hogg after an election is probably going to work. And I don't think it'd be a good look for the Democratic Party. But you know, to have a guy in his early 20s come in and say, I'm going to challenge all these, I'm going to make the Democratic Party more woke, more left wing, more, you know, in your face. You know, you're either trying to win national elections or you aren't. And that doesn't, I think Caitlin Free's she's more progressive than David.
You sound
Hogg.
like James Carville.
Yeah. I wish I had that accent. I could charge $20,000 a speech.
Well, you know, Tom, I want to talk about AOC for a second too, because she's one of the people that in a safe blue district that Hogg said he would not challenge, but she's kind of in the news because she has to decide whether to run for this. It's the top Democratic post on the House Oversight Committee. It's an important committee. Jerry Conley, who has it now, beat her just a little while ago for the spot. He's stepping down for health reasons. So the big question on the Hill, I guess, is whether or not she should do this or will do this. What do you make of the decision? And is it beneath her to take the top minority position on an important committee on Capitol Hill?
Why would it be beneath her?
Well, I can tell you why. One of her former aides, I'll tell you the quote. I think the work being done in oversight by the minority party is way less important than the work being done in communities and across America, painting a different path, a different vision for the Democratic Party.
Well, listen, I don't know about that. It is an important, listen, it's an important position. I mean, if she wants to be seen as someone who's going to be fighting, you know, but it does come with responsibilities. It comes with staff. It comes with, you know, she can't be out flying first class to go fight the oligarchy all around the country if she's missing, you know, oversight meetings. So, you know, it may be a burden that she doesn't want to bear, in the sense that it would restrain her from raising her profile in other ways for national office. So I think it just depends on, you know, she's obviously very ambitious and she's young, so she has lots of time, and there are lots of different paths to get to where she wants to go. And so she has to take all these things into consideration, but certainly it's an important position. I mean, oversight is a very powerful committee, and James Comer is the Republican who's running it. I mean, I think it would be good for her within the party to be seen as someone who's willing to go toe to toe with him. And we all know how these hearings get a lot of publicity, and she would be the big star on the Democratic side. So there's opportunity in it as well.
Yeah. Well, also, Andy, in 2 years, if the Democrats take control of the House as they expect to do, she'd be the chairwoman of the committee. And there's no question about that power.
Then they could impeach Trump.
It's
boom.
It's funny how things have come, how quickly things turn around. She was the type of candidate that David Hogg's talking about. She challenged an incumbent Democrat who had a very liberal record, by the way, and was in the House leadership in her district, ran a identity politics campaign against him, and won, you know, in a district with 600,000 or 700,000 people. I think she got, you know, like 19,000 votes. He got 16,000, very low turnout primary. That's the template, by the way. And now all of a sudden he has to say, "Oh, I'm not challenging her." I mean, like, she's the old guard now,
right?
Is she 30 yet?
Well, it is interesting. I rarely see this, where this question of whether or not you should actually do the kind of jobs that you were elected to do is more important than getting ready for your Senate, you know, challenge against Chuck Schumer or whatever it is she has in mind. To sort of just see that sort of being publicly debated, to me, interesting phenomenon. I don't know. But we'll see what she ends up doing. Anyway, you're listening to Real Clear Politics. Oh, go ahead, Todd.
I was just going to say, you know what they say about Congress? There are show horses and there are workhorses.
Well, good point. All right, we're going to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. Don't go away. We'll be back with more Real Clear Politics right after this.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, Real Clear Politics. Talking now with John Maxwell Hamilton. Friends call him Jack. He's a professor at LSU, a distinguished journalism professor and a columnist for RealClearPolitics. And he has a fascinating essay on our page today, May Day, which is fitting for reasons we'll get to in a moment, about a new book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, really about the Democratic Party and its approach to, whether it still wants to be the part of working class and how it goes about doing that. Jack, put it in your words, because you wrote a nice column. Tell our listeners what struck you about this book, and then I want to ask you a few questions about it.
Well, I think this book comes at a time when the Democrats are obviously spending a lot of effort soul searching what went wrong in the last election and what they should do differently. To my mind, one of the things they have to do differently is they have to come up with new ideas, not just repackage old ones. That doesn't mean the old ones, in many cases, but not all, had merit. But it's also true that many of the policies that have existed and been important to the Democrats have really appealed to a narrow group of elites and special interests. And the Democrats not only need to perhaps try to save some of those ideas, which are good, but they need to come up with new ideas that reach across the spectrum of American politics. And the authors of this book are really writing a love letter to the Democratic Party, but tough love letter, like you better do things differently. And one of them is to make the world work better for these people who are out there who are struggling because of globalization, or because medical costs have gone up, or whatever, and they need help, and we need to focus on them. And I think I'll just make one comment. I think one of the problems with a lot of slogans that Democrats have used in the last years is they're always about a group that they want to protect and advance. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But I think it's also true that everybody matters, and we need to talk in terms of what can help everybody. And this book, I think, it doesn't have all the answers, but it's a good start.
But they also talk about creating jobs, job creation, and expanding the pie, doing some of these things that, instead of to your point, instead of dividing up the spoils, growing the economy and doing the kind of things the Democrats, as recently, Bill Clinton talked about this extensively. Barack Obama less so, but the Democrats, if you paid attention to now, you'd think there's a limited amount of resources, and we have to make sure everybody gets their share. It sort of sets people against each other. And it seems to me the point of this book is that the Democrats, that's not aspirational. If the Democrats, that they could stand for more than that they could, and that maybe they don't say it quite this bluntly, but that free market capitalism isn't to be demonized. It's to be improved, governed, moderated, tweaked with, but that Democrats should embrace it. What do you, I
think there are a couple of things that could be said. First of all, they point out that if you're a small business person, you have so many hurdles that you have to go through to get something done.
Right. And
the result of that is endless frustration, huge loss of time, and the houses cost more.
Right.
And I understand why we want to make sure that people don't sell houses that are defective. We don't want asbestos in them. And so I understand why there's a level of inspection that needs to take place. But not every social goal needs to be laid onto every project that we do, because otherwise we don't get enough projects done. And so there's got to be a balance here. And I think what Klein and Thompson are saying is that balance hasn't existed. Small business people, I know, I just moved into a new house and had a fine builder. The amount of stuff that she had to do to build this house when I found out about it was mind-boggling.
In terms of local regulations.
Yeah, and added a huge percentage to the cost of this house. So that's one problem. But the other one is the government can do things better and faster. And there are times when we do streamline projects, but we need to do it more often. It's ridiculous that we had a $7.5 billion budget proposal, or we have a budget of $7.5 billion to help build charging stations. And at the end of the Biden administration, we built about 37.
Yeah.
Well, there's just, you can't look at that and think that that's okay. That defies common sense.
Now, Jack, remind me the name of their book. Let's
Abundance.
Yeah.
And that title, by the way, Carl, goes to your point. That is, their argument is we can get a lot more of a lot of things if we work smarter.
Yeah. Jack, I was thinking about in terms of this book, this is not a new problem in the Democratic Party. And I understand, the party of working people is going to be sort of set up in opposition to big business and to union busting and, some even to some degree automation and globalization. That makes sense to me. But what they've slipped over in recent years, and I don't mean recent years, really in the last generation, to Democrats say how much they like jobs, but they really don't have much good to say about employers or even entrepreneurs, the people who create jobs. So how would you go about changing this mindset? I think about this. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez fought Jeff Bezos, from bringing an Amazon distribution warehouse into her district that would have created thousands of jobs. She opposed it. This flew in the face of everything I knew about local politics. Didn't seem to hurt her. Didn't seem to hurt her standing in the party. How do the Democrats go about changing this mindset?
Yeah, I mean, you made me stop and think about that. I think I do think we have a problem in this country with income inequality and wealth inequality, and that's a huge problem, and that's a recipe for problems. You can't have 1% of the population own 90% of the wealth, and there's just something wrong with that. And so I think people like Bernie Sanders and AOC are hitting at that point, and they're concerned that this may become even more aggravated as a result of special interests having their way. But I think it's also important that we understand why we need to help business people be able to get something done. It's my father's, alas, long gone. He was a small businessman. And I used to tease him and I'd say, you're a Republican, but you don't get any help from anybody. Well, you struggle, you should be a Democrat. And he would laugh. And I say, the people who are getting big handouts are the people who are corporate giants. If they have a problem, they get government handouts all the time, but you never get any government handouts. I mean, that was a long, long time ago. That was 70 years ago or 60 years ago when I was having those conversations with him. But I think it's true. There are a lot of people out there who want government to work well, who believe in the norms of democracy, but they also want to have a chance to not spend all their time messing around with rules they shouldn't be messing around with.
Yeah. So looking ahead to 2028 already, I'm thinking of this because the Democrats, we have these dueling factions in the party, and but our politics now are so personality driven, so top down driven. You don't really have a leader of the party who speaks for that party till you have a presidential nominee. Are there any people out there, any governors or senators in the Democratic Party who understand the lessons of this book, Abundance, and who seem poised in your mind to be able to take this message out to the country?
I think I've detected that there are some people who are understanding that the party has to react in a positive way, not just being critical, a positive way with regard to the great majority of Americans. Elise Stefanik, for example, she says some things that are very, very smart, down to earth, like not fancy, just like honest. Even people like Newsom, who's known to be obviously a blue person in a very blue state, has been careful about how he's positioning himself. He obviously wants to be a president, and he's reeled back on some things. And I think that's good, because whether he should be president or not, I'm not saying, but I think if people see that the way forward to winning an election is to actually start moving a little bit to the middle, where many Americans are, myself included, then maybe that will catch on.
Well, Gavin Newsom, you mentioned he was a restaurant owner in San Francisco. He was a small business guy who went through the red tape in San Francisco. My hometown was so onerous. He ran for city council. He got involved in local government. Then he became mayor, lieutenant governor. But this is his origin story in politics: is trying to get the Democratic Party to help small business, because small business, most new job creation, we've known this for 3 generations, is either small business or startups. They're not all small business, but new, entrepreneurship. And I think the Democratic Party has to re-embrace that. Anyway, that's going to do it for us. You've been listening to Jack Hamilton, professor at LSU and a columnist for Real Clear Politics. Please look at his column today. It was on our front page this morning. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, and we'll be right back after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics. I'm Andrew Walworth, and joining me now is Phil Wegmann, White House correspondent for Real Clear Politics. Phil, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So you have a piece on the RCP front page, which will be of special interest to anyone in the audience who's in the federal government. And the headline is "No Participation Trophies. Trump Revamps Performance Reviews for Top Bureaucrats." So what's going on?
So what is going on is the performance reviews are about to get a lot more difficult for the upper echelon of the bureaucracy. These are the executives, usually folks who are one level below a political appointee, such as a cabinet secretary. And what the White House is doing with this new rule is they are letting those folks know, there's usually about 8,000 of these senior executives, that the performance metrics are going to be much stricter. Under the current regime, about 96% of these senior executives in the federal government, they're getting top marks. What the White House is doing is they're proposing a new rule called forced distribution, where only so many folks will actually be above average. And this has all sorts of ramifications for things like bonuses and promotions. But, you know, the takeaway here at the 30,000 foot view is the administration sees the federal bureaucracy as the deep state. And with this new rule change, what they're doing is they're making life more difficult for that upper echelon of bureaucrats. And this goes hand in hand with the efforts of Elon Musk and Doge to make a more efficient government by clearing out some of the folks that have been there for a long time.
And so these people, you say there's about 8,000 of them. Who are they? Where do they live? And what kind of money do they make?
They're making pretty good money. The salary ranges between about $180,000 and I believe $240,000. There's 8,000 of them, the overwhelming majority, live in Washington, D.C. This is the definition of elite entrenched bureaucracy. And the irony here is that in these performance reviews, 96% are getting high marks, and yet the American public increasingly doesn't have trust in government. And these guys are in every single agency. So the higher standards, the idea of no longer handing out participation trophies, the administration hopes that's going to lead to more accountability and perhaps moving some of these folks out of their jobs.
And when we say participation trophies, these are the real consequences here, right? Because it affects your pay and I guess your pay. That's the main thing, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to, right?
It affects your pay and also any type of promotion that these folks might have beyond what they already do. These senior executives, the idea is if you've got someone at Veteran Affairs, the Department of Energy, you want someone who's going to serve across administrations and develop that expertise. What we saw under the Biden administration is that their growth really exploded. There were a lot more senior executives than there were previously. And it's a small community, relatively small in comparison to some of the other folks who have been affected by Doge and by the Trump administration. But this one is going to have oversized effects because, the argument from the White House has been that if the bureaucracy is in charge and if they can undermine what the president wants to do, then we no longer live in a democracy. We live in a sort of administrative state. And this is just another it's just another sort of pinprick, another reform, another cut to try and change all of that.
Yeah. Well, small, 8,000, but not so small that they don't have some sort of representation, right? They have the Senior Executives Association. What does the Senior Executives Association say about all this?
Certainly they don't like it. The Senior Executives Association is a bit of a trade group for government employees. They're here in Washington, D.C., and they are of the opinion, not one that I think is held by most Americans, that folks in these government jobs are there solely because of merit. The administration clearly doesn't believe that.
Yeah. Well, there's some politics around this, local politics as well. Don Beyer, who's a Democrat, represents Northern Virginia. He introduced the Rehire Act, which is restoring and hiring incentives for removed employees. This is I don't think it's going to get anywhere in the Republican Congress, but basically the idea is to give fired federal employees preference for new federal jobs. This is a way to get those that 1% or so of federal employees who've been let go under Trump a leg up, kind of like veterans have when it comes to federal hiring. On the surface of it, it sounds like a pretty reasonable idea, I guess, but what do you make of it? And like I said, I don't think it's going anywhere on the Hill, but it shows you the power of federal employees in the Washington metro area for sure.
Absolutely. I can't imagine that a president AOC starting in 2029 wouldn't immediately reach out to some of these fired bureaucrats or bureaucrats who retired early. But if you take a step back, I think that there's a larger cultural question happening here. I was talking to Indiana Senator Jim Banks, who had an interesting confrontation with a fired HHS employee. And that employee tracked him down in the Senate, said, are you going to do anything for fired federal employees such as myself? And Banks, who's normally kind of exudes Hoosier hospitality, he's kind of a reserved fellow. He said, you probably deserved it. And that was harsh, right? But if you think about it, there was maybe a one-day story. There certainly wasn't a lot of follow-up when a lot of these manufacturing plants in the Midwest closed, right? It wasn't until the journalist and academic class got around to reading The China Shock in 2014 that they started to think, oh my, some of this deindustrialization is a bad idea. So it's interesting that it's almost as if these federal employees are a protected class, and we have had nonstop wall-to-wall coverage from the very beginning of the Trump administration, 100 days now. And yet, I can't recall the New York Times writing about, Harvester pulling out of Indiana. And if they did, they certainly didn't give it a second day story. So I think it shows sort of the power of those constituencies and the emphasis of, some folks who live on the coast.
Yeah. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Phil Wegmann, our White House correspondent. Elon Musk talked to reporters yesterday at the White House. It's kind of an exit interview, I guess. A couple highlights from it. The goal, I think it was $2 trillion, then it was $1 trillion. They say DOGE has cut $160 billion is what they're at right now. And speaking of federal workforce, he claims it's 1% of the federal workforce. He said it's been efficient, but not as efficient as he would have liked. And he added, being attacked is not super fun. There's a real Muskism, isn't it? And seeing cars on fire is not fun. It sounds like he's really heading for the exit this time. What do you make of it? And, how should we think about DOGE at this point? Is it going to continue?
We've heard from the White House that the work of DOGE will continue even without Elon Musk. And my expectation is in the months and years ahead that work will be more targeted. It's likely to be driven by folks like Russ Vought, the director of OMB. But if you look at Elon Musk, there are a lot of people who will dive into those numbers and question them, as they absolutely should. I mean, I think that the DOGE team has on occasion exaggerated their cuts. But the effect of Elon Musk, the world's richest man, doing an audit of the federal government, I don't think the effect is so much in percentages of the spending cut as much as it is in the way that Musk has tried to change the culture. There's really a, sort of pop culture fluency here in that he is forcing the press, forcing Washington, D.C. to confront, the fact that there were 500,000 credit cards for federal employees. Why was that? Why was it that federal employees' retirement information was stored underground in an abandoned salt mine? I think that that's the effect here, and it's going to be the momentum that carries over for some of these more significant cuts, I think, that a Russ Vought and others will carry out. Musk likely set the table, and more serious cuts will come after him.
But does it raise the question, and this sort of goes back to what we were talking about before, we got about a minute left here. People have talked about cutting the federal government ever since I was well, certainly before I was in Washington, but that was a long time ago when I started. And we've had commissions and blue ribbon this and blue ribbon that. And now we had Doge. And, is it just a ratchet that can, at the bottom line, only go in one direction, that the government only can grow and it can't be reversed? Because this, you would think, would be about as big guns as you could throw against the problem, if you consider it a problem. The world's richest man, ear of the president, big White House push. And it seems, at least at this point, like it's only been 100 days, but it looks like it's a little bit in retreat.
A few months ago, I was talking to a longtime budget wonk in Washington, D.C., and I asked this person, can you recall a moment when the federal government actually cut spending, actually achieved some savings? Other than the sequester in, I think it was 2013 or 2014, they haven't. And what we've seen time and time again is the Republicans are hypocrites. And I think that, they would admit as much as well. This is not, to cast aspersion on them. But when Democrats are in control, they're fiscal conservatives. And then when they are in the driver's seat, they sort of set aside all of their budget hawkishness. And we're gearing up to see something pretty similar. But Musk, he set the table here. The idea was that they were going to go after waste, fraud, and abuse. And it's going to be difficult, I think, for this administration to, really glob on a lot more spending. It might be a bit embarrassing, but they're going to have to face tough questions. For instance, the reconciliation bill that just went through the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House, it includes $250 million for the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. I thought that this was the administration that cared about cutting spending, not the one that cared about a swamp opera house. But politicians remain hypocritical. Story at 11.
All right, Phil, we're going to have to leave it there. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've been talking to Phil Wegmann. He's our White House correspondent. That's our program for today. Thank you for listening. We'll be back here tomorrow. Hope to see you then. Have a great evening.